Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where each broadcasting from tonight, we pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. This is the Frontier Forum, a conversation series presented by the University of Queensland's Global Change Institute. The Frontier Forum is a space for community discussion and debate around the big ideas, challenges and changes that are set to shape our future. I'm Tegan Taylor. I'm a journalist with the ABC's Science Unit, and I'm your host and moderator for this series. This is our second Frontier Forum. A warm welcome to those joining us for the first time, and welcome back if you joined us for our deeply fascinating, if slightly unsettling, event on superbugs in November. You can watch that one back via the series website if you missed it. You might notice if you joined us last time that I'm unfortunately not in the UQ studio with my panellists tonight, as I was then. Life in a pandemic has forced us to join from separate locations this time, but thankfully we live in the Zoom age and have this option available to us, because I've been really looking forward to this discussion. Now, I will introduce tonight's panel in just a tick, but a reminder that we really want to hear from you tonight. Please send in questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window as we go along. And thanks so much to those of you who've submitted some fantastic questions in advance. Listen out for your name when I put your questions to our panel in just a minute. Of course, we're tackling another huge topic tonight, building better cities. We're going to get stuck into what makes cities livable, sustainable, and resilient. Essentially, how we future-proof our urban landscapes. Joining me on the panel are Currie, a globally recognised city planner and the Chief Planner for Brisbane City Council. Di is the Brisbane 2032 Host City Office Lead and a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Cities of Tomorrow. Professor Mark Hickman, an expert on public transport who is the Department of Transport and Main Roads Chair and Professor of Civil Engineering in the School of Civil Engineering here at UQ. And Christina Cho, a Director of International Architecture Studio Cox Architecture, who was awarded the 2018 Australian Institute of Architects National Emerging Architect Prize. Welcome, folks. Let's get straight into it. Di, I'm going to start with you. You've got a really impressive background as a city planner. You're an advocate for sustainable urbanisation, and you're contributing to a range of global groups on this topic, in addition to the leadership role that you hold with Brisbane City Council. Can you give us some context on where Queensland and Australia sit on the spectrum when it comes to smart and sustainable approaches to urban development? How do we fare on a global scale?
Look, I think we have to start with the fact that this is an incredibly beautiful and livable place to live, and we all cherish that. And I think we've seen the importance of that shine over the COVID period in particular, with people from all over Australia choosing to move up into our region. So I'd have to say I think we've got some things going for us and we're doing things really well. I see in my work around the world a lot of really great examples, and I see those also operating here in Brisbane. I think we're doing some great things in terms of parks, city building, the new metro construction by Brisbane City Council. That's landmark and really impressive. And we're doing some amazing things as a city in terms of smart city development. So I think we're performing pretty well.
Love it, punching above our weight. Mark, can you share what you think maybe are some of the key challenges that we face in this region when it comes to things like smart city design?
I think there are a number of challenges that are facing Brisbane as we look toward the next 20 or 30 years, involving how we better manage our infrastructure, how we better manage our transport system, and how we can better improve those over time so that as we look toward the Olympics in 2032 and the period after the Olympics and the legacy of our Olympics going forward, there's a legacy of better infrastructure. As a civil engineer, that's my bread and butter, and that's something that we really look forward to helping to build into a longer term sustainability of Brisbane and Southeast Queensland more generally.
We've seen a pretty major combined infrastructure announcement for Southeast Queensland. It's a joint thing from the federal, state and local governments. Mark, do you think that will be enough to sort of address the infrastructure challenges that you see us having?
If I was being honest, I would say probably not, but the Southeast Queensland City deal that was signed earlier this week is only one step toward the full set of infrastructure projects and other major investments that I think are needed across our region. I think it's fantastic that we can get the federal, state, and local governments all involved in supporting Southeast Queensland and many of the major infrastructure projects that we have going on in Southeast Queensland. But I think that's just the first step that we need to be thinking about. Certainly having that level of collaboration and financial support is really very important, but we're going to need that and even more going forward. So,
Christina, from an architect's perspective, what do you think we're doing well? Like, are there some bright spots in our region?
Absolutely. And I think, the greatest thing about our city is the lifestyle. The subtropical weather means that we can design to embrace the outdoors, to have vibrant green spaces. And, that is a real key identity of Brisbane. And I think in terms of planning, there's really, different ways of we can look at our city by looking at unifying principles. We've got lifestyle, we've got knowledge corridors. We need to look at how we can embrace the river and all our natural amenity and assets, but also, I guess, recently, we need to look further into how we might provide resilience and protection from floods and bushfires.
Can we talk a bit about, so you're talking about green and outdoor sort of things as being priorities, and also Queensland's a vast state, but you've actually been involved in the Queensland's first vertical school in Fortitude Valley. How do you manage the marriage of high density and still retain that sense of space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think during the COVID lockdowns, our relationships with our local parks, our streets have changed, and we've learned to embrace them and really realize the importance of these spaces for our well-being and our lifestyle. So the Fortitude Valley State Secondary College was in response to the rapid urban growth in the inner city area. It's a first school to be built in the inner city in 60 years. And we had to go vertical because we did a test of overlaying our site with a conventional green field site, and it's only about a fifth of the site, so we had to go vertical. And there's lots of incredible things that you can get with verticality in terms of supporting contemporary teaching and learning, which is you have the opportunity to kind of consolidate different areas of learning for that kind of cross-pollination, cross-learning, the idea of transparency, bringing people, the students higher up to kind of look out onto the city and, trigger curiosity to say, and to kind of tell them that the world is their classroom.
That's beautiful. So you mentioned resilience, and we're going to talk about that now. We did get questions from the audience ahead of time, and a lot of people asked about the recent floods and climate change and how we build a city that's resilient in that perspective. Paola from the UQ School of Architecture asks, in light of the recent flood event in Brisbane, and of course it wasn't just contained to Brisbane, how would you approach its reconstruction or better urban regeneration to achieve climate resilience? Are there viable pathways to transform a consolidated urban fabric? Now, Di, I know that this is exactly what you've been working on today in your day job.
Look, it certainly is. And I think we are a river city. We're a city that also has a lot of creeks, and water is a fundamental part of our city, and we don't retreat from that. This is part of the joy of living here, although it does come, of course, with its challenges, and we saw that recently. But it's about making sure that we design and build appropriately for that. And I think there are a couple of really clever examples of things that worked very well in this last dreadful flood and weather event that I'd like to focus on for a second. Things like the City Cat terminals. We saw in the previous flood the tremendous damage to both the walkway along Riverwalk and, of course, the CityCat terminals. We had them rebuilt. I say we, it was council, I wasn't with council at the time. Council rebuilt them in a more resilient form, and we saw very little damage to Riverwalk this time around. And we had CityCat terminals built in a manner designed to open the gangway, in particular to allow the water to move through. Now, they largely performed incredibly well, and we've seen a totally different scale of impact compared to last time. We've also had programs running for community members to rebuild and to raise their houses in some areas, but also to acknowledge that there are different techniques and building materials to use, such as marine ply or blue board, where you're acknowledging that if there's water or silt to come through, there's a cleaning exercise, but those restaurants were able to open and be running as businesses again relatively quickly. So I think there's lots there to think about. You know, we've got programs in place now where lifts and electrical services are no longer able to be built in basements. They need to be built higher up, so that yes, there'll be water that moves through a basement area, but the building itself can continue to function. So I think it's about learning each time and making sure that what we're doing is building ourselves to be resilient for these events.
So resilience is a sense of being able to bounce back, not avoiding these sorts of catastrophes altogether, but being able to recover quickly from them.
Yes.
Mark, your thoughts on this? Oh, sorry, Christina.
Oh, Mark, I'll let you go first.
Okay, sure. I was only going to concur with that. I think it's important that we understand resilience and sustainability not as we avoid these things entirely, or avoid the kind of disasters or shocking events in and of themselves, or that we're prepared for any eventuality. It's more that we're able to bounce back quickly when they do occur. And I think the example of the CityCat ferries and the ferry terminals along the river are a great example of that, where from the 2011 experience, there was a lot learned and a lot of progress made in making infrastructure along the river a lot more resilient, or could be brought back online much quicker.
Yeah, I guess while we're on the topic of the ferry terminals, our company, along with Oricon, we're very privileged to be part of that innovative piece of infrastructure. And that was a design competition held after the 2011 floods. And we were watching the terminals as the floods were rising, and my heart was in my throat as I saw the houseboat smash against the concrete mast at Home Street. It's a devastating time, and it really was heartbreaking to see all of that. The strategy for those terminals, they've never been done anywhere in the world, is very novel. And so the fact that they worked, but it was very sad to see them in practice so soon, really was a testament to kind of the bold vision that the council had back at that time. In terms of the question and the flood resilience, I think we really need to take a human-centered approach to recovery and rebuilding of homes and lives. People don't choose to live or establish their workplaces in flood zones, and there really needs to be a consideration of their connection to place, their memories. You can't just uproot people from their communities. So we also need to think about, how we can support them, how we can allow people to remain safe in the communities they love. We also need to understand the needs of the residents and provide consolidated information and educate them so that they can make informed decisions, which is the right circumstances for them, whether it is to rebuild or relocate and resettle. And I think affordability is a really critical issue on which solution they choose.
I mean, a lot of that really comes down to planning. Di, do you have a response to what Christina's just said?
I largely agree. I think not everybody wants to move out of their homes and their communities. So it's looking at how can that happen? How can they do that? How can they stay if that's what they choose to do, but in a manner that makes them safe, and also thinking through which is why council allowed the change in heights in some areas and encouraged that resilient home rebuild process. So it's again looking at how do we learn to adapt and live with this in some areas.
So that's something that's floods really forced us to ask some big questions about the future of our cities. And of course, we know that part of the future of Brisbane is the Olympic and Paralympic Games and all that's going to mean for our region. We've had a lot of really good questions from the audience around how we can harness the games to transform our cities for the future. So we'll start with this question from Leah, who says, well, I'll put this to you, Di, because you're the expert. What do you think will be the biggest challenge for Brisbane in hosting the 2032 Olympics?
For me, this is I think of this as a once in a lifetime opportunity for our city. There are cities in the world that have hosted the games a couple of times, but I'm not going to be cheeky enough to think that we might get that opportunity just yet. So for me, there is how do we get our community and the world to see us as a global city, but also retaining that special nature of life in Brisbane and how we convey that at the same time. So for me, it's about how do we bring our community on the journey to appreciate all of the excitement and joy and opportunity that this brings us and to support it. I think we should be making the absolute most that we possibly can out of this extraordinary opportunity we have. At the same time as also making sure that we make it special. Sydney is retained in memory as being such a positive experience and such a friendly games. How do we build and create our own identity? I do a lot of thinking and a lot of talking with people about what do they want the 2032 Brisbane Olympic and Paralympic Games to be remembered for. And I think that's a conversation we all need to be having with our community.
What kind of things do they say when you ask them that question?
There's a lot of conversation about lifestyle. And I think that's probably really paramount in people's minds as a result of COVID. People became so much more attached to their local parks and to their local neighbourhoods. And we saw that. We saw people supporting their local cafes, businesses and shopping centres. People's identity has become really quite clear now about their attachment to Brisbane. So for me, some of the conversations have been about how do we do that? How do we have world-class events and all of the fun and excitement that brings, but also making sure that we convey to the world that we live in such a special place. So we're looking for all of those opportunities, of course.
What excites you, Christina, about the prospect of Brisbane Olympics as an architect?
So I immigrated to Australia when I was 5 years old in 1988. So that was just before, from Seoul, and that was just before Seoul was hosting the Olympic Games. So I would love to be in a city when they're actually hosting the Games. Brisbane is actually going to be one of the smallest and youngest cities to host the Summer Games. And the Brisbane 2032 proposal was around a sustainable games, that we are games ready. And then, in comparison, because we're competing against other cities, the other kind of key factors were that we're politically stable. All three levels of government have committed to it, which means a really great investment. We have a benevolent climate, which is really attractive. And it's going to be a cost-effective and sustainable games because Brisbane already has 80% of the venues. And, the Olympic Games, it's 10 years away, but really it's only 6 weeks of ceremonies and events across the Olympics and the Paralympics. So we're not really planning for the Olympics. The Olympics is just a catalyst for change and commitment from our city, from our residents, from our governments. And as Di said, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity for us and a once in a city's lifetime for city making. At our practice, when we design a project, we take a client through a visioning session and we ask them what their spark is. So what's their why? And then we ask them what their legacy is when they complete the project. And I think it's and involves a process that involves understanding their needs, hopes, and values. And I really believe this has to be our approach to the Olympics, and what we can achieve for our city.
Mark, sorry.
Can I just chip in just so that Christina says it's 10 years away and it's a long time. It's 3,775 days.
No pressure. No pressure.
No pressure.
I currently run an hourly countdown, but I reckon it's coming. Sorry, over to you.
No, we had a fantastic question from Greta, which I'll put to Mark. How feasible is it that everyone could travel by public transport to all of the Olympic Games events, including on the Sunshine and Gold Coast?
There's the challenge. I think, as far as I understand, the real challenge is to get people to those games without letting people drive to the games directly. And that's going to involve, it's a difficult activity. This is really one of the first Olympic Games that is really regional in scope, between the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, and Brisbane itself. And that involves moving a lot of people, including the athletes, but also the spectators, between each of those different venues. And our public transport system has to be up to that challenge. And I think there's a lot of work going on now already to prepare for that kind of event, with the expansion of the Sunshine Coast rail links, the Cross River Rail projects that are going on. Metro is going to be an important element of at least moving people around within the city itself. And many of those investments are now going on, which we will see being exploited really during the Olympic Games to support public transport as the primary backbone of moving people around during the Olympics.
It's such a fabulous opportunity, and it brings out the idea of how we might engage people. And I wondered if you could talk to us about an approach that you've taken in the past when it comes to getting community engagement in town planning, the gamification of planning Brisbane.
It's a really interesting, for me, this is all about coming back to us being a smart city and using intelligent and current approaches. The particular project that we did a couple of years ago was called Plan Your Brisbane, and it was a very clearly designed community engagement piece by council to look at the future of the city and to make sure that we're engaging with that community. That project involved what we would say are normal forms of community engagement. You know, we went out and stood in the mall, we went out to community events, we wrote to people, we had normal surveys, but we also engaged an incredibly powerful piece, designed a powerful piece of gamification, where we let people, both on laptops and also on their mobiles, engage in an exercise where they could pick. You had to house a number of people, and it took about 6 minutes to run through, and you could pick the differences between the sort of density mixes that you wanted to test. So if you wanted to see the impacts of having just low density housing, you could see what that did to the availability of land for open space, or to the ability for cars to move on a roadway, versus if you mixed it up, what that meant in terms of potentially enough people to support a new business or the potential for a new public transport route. And it did all of that without judgment. So it let you explore the consequences to what is a very complex decision-making process. And then it let you decide which one you liked the most, and you could submit it and tell us about why you liked it. As an exercise, as an overarching exercise, Plan Your Brisbane was amazingly successful. We had more than 100,000 residents have their say. They generated 15,000 ideas. So that turns out to be 1 in 5 households. We had input from every single age group and every suburb across the city. That's inordinately powerful. Now, we made a very deliberate decision to engage with all age groups. We had activity on pedestrian TV, which is something I hadn't done before, really made an effort to get out and reach the community. And what we had were things like young people. Sorry, the smile on my face is a particular public event where a family came up to speak to me to say that their kids had played the game the day before, taken it to their parents over dinner. And when I say kids, they were 16 and 17, and said to their parents, we want a different form of housing to what you've always thought we would. We're happier to use somebody else's backyard and not maintain it, and have a great park nearby. So it allowed that sort of intergenerational conversation to have to occur, and for people to share different thoughts about the future. So for me, we need to remember that the world is constantly changing, and people's methods of communication and engagement are changing, and make sure we connect with them in those different ways.
What was the quote though that you got from one of the participants that you framed and put on your wall?
I had this wonderful email from somebody, just a resident sending into the program, saying that they had not previously understood just how complicated our job is in planning, and thank you for what you do, and that just made my night. I'm pretty sure I was reading that one in the wee hours.
There is a thing though, isn't it, with like, I want my suburb and my roads and my city to work for me, and I sort of don't really care what other people have. And a lot of people have been asking questions about public transport versus vehicles, which is one of the real kind of tension points here. What do we do, Mark, to have Brisbane be a more a sustainable, livable city when we already have such a individual vehicle-centric mindset at the moment?
That's a great question. And that's a challenging nut to crack. It's not that there's a single solution to try and solve that sort of problem. We think that there's a wide variety of things that we need to be thinking about. I think there's a number of things that we can do to make walking and bicycling more attractive. I think if we can improve the walkability of at least certain areas of Brisbane that aren't as hilly as others, I think having things like e-bikes, e-scooters make it a little easier to get around some of the hills. Although I've heard a lot of people say that they can't e-bike or e-scooter because some of the hills are just too steep. But I think there's a greater interest and real question emerging with Brisbane City Council and TMR as well, about how do we actually accommodate that kind of mobility, those personal mobility devices. How do we better accommodate those in our transportation system? We've seen bike lanes appear in the CBD. We've seen, we're now actually going to see, fortunately, a separate lane on Coro Drive to accommodate bicycles, while the Bicentennial Bikeway is temporarily blocked because of the restaurant that seemed to have moved over onto the Bicentennial Bikeway. And we've seen a lot of investment. I know certainly within my part of where I live in Brisbane and other parts of Brisbane, a lot more investment in riverside walkways and other areas, amenities to encourage walking and cycling around Brisbane. And while that's not the only solution, I think that's at least part of the answer to how we get, at least around the inner suburbs and the CBD, a much more walkable, much more sustainable transport system in those sorts of areas. I think there's still a larger question of what you do outside the inner area of Brisbane and how you best accommodate transport. That's a broader conversation with Brisbane City Council, with other city councils, the SEQ city deal and other things like that, where we try and get a lot of the local government agencies to cooperate with state and try and figure out how best to provide the transport needs that they have. So
it's an aesthetic thing as well, though, isn't it? Like, Christina, what does having just lots of roads and cars do to the architecture, the personality of a city?
Well, I think, the way to reduce cars and that infrastructure is really to design our suburbs better, and that they're more vibrant and more diverse. So, the idea of decentralizing the concentration of maybe the inner city activity and bringing that diversity of uses, building typologies to a wider demographic, and supporting all of that greater public amenity to our suburbs, because the inner city is only 10% of Brisbane. We really need to consider our suburbs and how we build them better. And I think the Brisbane River, it's a lifeline of our city. It's valuable, but it can also be destructive. It's also the biggest barrier for connectivity in our city. So we need greater river connectivity, greater connections, across to connect these kind of vibrant villages. And I think, considering how our city is more like an ecosystem, like a network of neighborhoods and villages rather than kind of distinct precincts, and in that way connecting them through active transport.
So just a reminder to people who are watching tonight, you can ask questions. We encourage you to do so by clicking on the Q&A and popping your question in there. We're going to get to some of those questions in just a tick, and there's already some really great ones coming through. But just to talk about where we're heading or how we can head forward in a more productive way, there's been a lot of people asking about breaking down silos of professions and thinking, or what young people can do to be involved in sustainable futures. I'd love to hear from all of you on this, of what we could be doing as an industry or as a society to be coming to this together. Di, I might start with you.
Sorry, I got your question, this question, and then thinking through some of those changing nature of the last two responses. I think we need to applaud and think about the positive side of growth as well. I'm not sure we shout about that. So, getting growth in a suburb, the one in my head at the moment is when a particular suburb had grown enough that it could have its own local cinema. So there are things that you get that you only get as a result of growth. So I think we need to remember to talk about that, and that improves the vibrancy of local neighbourhoods. That changing scale of growth then also leads to being able to invest in some of the major pieces of transformational infrastructure like metro. I am still incredibly impressed that Brisbane City Council, with some assistance from the feds and as a result of City Deal, now the state, is delivering a metro system that enables us to get more people onto a turn up and go system, which then changes that viability and pace of movement. So I think we have to, as a community and as residents, remember to shout about the positive things as well. We all hear about, people are cranky about the number of cars on the road. It's also remembering that if you choose to say, I want everybody else off the roads so that I can drive quickly, that's not helpful. So, I walk the talk. I go by bus because I actually find it faster than trying to drive to work. It's just more convenient for me, and I enjoy that. So I think that's probably the biggest thing to do, to remember that we as citizens should also be remembering to praise and to tell our elected officials at every level when things are going well.
Great point. Christina?
I might answer your question around school children and how we might educate them around sustainability. So, schools, they're not just places of learning for students, they're workplaces for teachers. So they really have to be inspiring environments that reward attendance, they spark curiosity and a lifelong passion for learning. And I think every school needs to be a demonstration project around sustainable values. You can embed learning about sustainability in the curriculum and support that with real-world project-based learning. So, for example, we've recently completed a large expansion to West End State School, which doubles the student capacity. So 60% of the students, they live in high-rise apartments. And so the concept we used there was about creating learning landscapes that intertwine nature, play, and learning, so that every opportunity between class changes, students had access to the outdoors. We pushed all the buildings to the perimeter to really maximize the open green play spaces, and that's all supported by large, cool covered undercroft spaces, which is, you know, really valuable in our climate. So I think in terms of creating sustainable buildings for that people use every day is a key to kind of educating and embedding that way of life.
Oh, sorry, Mark, how do we do this? How do we do this at a societal level?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, let me comment on a couple other things that maybe were part of the conversation. Just to follow up on what I was saying earlier about walking and cycling. City Council's commitment, for example, to the new bridges, green bridges across the river, I think are really great things for our community. And I really admire Council for really supporting that as a big area of promoting walking and cycling around. More to the question of sustainability, I think there's a number of issues there. I find myself that I feel at times very stuck in the idea that sustainability involves things that are green or things that are environmentally benign or things that maybe give back to the environment. And I'm called at times to remember, well, that also means that we have to make things affordable. It means that we have to consider economic viability as well as what we're doing socially. And in many cases, as an engineer, I find it difficult to remember that we're not just solving problems for and trying to create a sustainable world for some people or just worried about the environment. This is a broader issue that we have to deal with in society more generally, and making things both affordable as well as available to a broad spectrum of our community.
Yeah, sustainability as having a lot of different interpretations. Let's get into some questions. Again, it's not too late to submit your question by going to the Q&A function. You can also upvote questions. If you feel like someone's already articulated what you wanted to know, you can do that. And we'll start with the most popular question so far from Lisa Ottenhouse, who says, a question for Di and Mark. COVID caused a shift from public transport to cars and active transport. However, the city cats are not currently running. A lot of bikeways are still covered in debris or even destroyed. Corro Drive and other arteries are at daily standstill. Despite skyrocketing fuel prices, how many problems can we throw into one area? What are some of the ways to add resilience to transport? Where do you see the future of transport? How could we see more public and active transport? Di or Mark, I'll get you to just chime straight in on that.
We're trying to work out who wants to talk first.
Yeah.
It's a really hard question. I think I'd want the other person to answer it too.
Well, yes and no. Can I, before we go to the sort of transporty answer, I think the other thing to also think about from a COVID perspective was, I personally think it fundamentally changed work patterns. So, you know, yes, we saw people change their behaviours for a while from a COVID perspective. What we've also seen is that it's changed. I suspect people will always now want some measure of working from home. I think we also need and want and should have the engagement in our offices with people. That creativity is fundamental, but some measure of that flexibility, I think, is certainly being seen worldwide as demanded. That has also then, of course, changed some of those transport life patterns as well. So I think that's something we've also got to remember as part of this. And we have seen people going back to public transport. I think it's just that, you know, it's been a hard couple of years in. Yes, we're back. No, we're not. Yes, we're back. No, we're not. And I understand that that's difficult for people. It's also given us the opportunity, though, to see massive changes in e-bikes and scooters and people's behaviour changing in different ways, utilising more active transport. Sorry, Mark, you can talk the pure engineering stuff.
I guess I would only add, in COVID, there were a lot of people who had the discretion to be able to either not travel into work or travel by other means. And I think that's perfect. That's the sign of a resilient system. At the same time, I think it really proved in many respects the value of public transport in our community, because we were still transporting people who were essential workers to their jobs, to various amenities and things like that they needed in their life. And while you might say a lot of people left public transport, I think there was still the opportunity to show just the value of public transport to our community. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And we are seeing the amount of people using public transport come back, particularly this year in comparison to the previous 2 years, but we are seeing that grow again. But I do think we are fortunate here in Brisbane to be able to have other alternatives for travel as well. The bicycling, e-bikes, e-scooters, and many other options that are available to people in Brisbane.
Another theme that has come through in the questions, both the pre-submitted ones and the ones that are coming through now, are about cultural and historic architecture. Scott has said Brisbane doesn't have the best track record with this. Carlotta is asking about what's the role of cultural heritage in building resilient and sustainable cities. I might start with you on this one, Christina.
I guess we need to think about cultural heritage beyond, before our kind of colonization. You know, the First Nations people have designed for country for hundreds of thousands of years. So it's a way of kind of engaging with our First Nations people to respectfully and authentically understand their principles for caring for country. I think that's paramount. So understanding the traditional use of the land, returning some areas to traditional use and planning authentic ways to kind of connect these, to connect our cultural heritage. In terms of post-colonization cultural heritage, I think it's inevitable. We have to plan for development and growth. That is how our city will thrive. But it really needs to be done at the same time as preserving character areas of tin and timber, because that Queenslander vernacular, that's a physical representation of how we've evolved over time and respond to our local climatic and environmental cultural needs. And so it needs to remain relevant because it reinforces our identity as a city.
Diana, you've got strong feelings on this as well.
Yeah, I think there's some areas, and I would say we've done really well in this space, and we should, again, cherish that and be proud of it. And I think of places like Tenerife. It's one of our most dense mixed-use suburbs. It's also one of our most livable. It's got the physicality of the river. It's got architectural heritage that's been protected. We've got such great examples of where we've retained heritage and then created really quite vibrant job and entertainment and cultural precincts. In between the wool stores, the gasometer, Cutter's Landing, the powerhouse, they're really clever pieces of delivery that are great places that we all enjoy going to. So that's the sort of European settlement phase. But coming back to Christina's point around the Indigenous heritage, there's some really powerful work being done in terms of designing with country and for country. And that's something we've been really conscious of in the council, and also as part of our landscape design for Victoria Park, which is another one of the great projects I get to be involved in. So I think it is about how we connect with and be conscious of and complementary to our history as part of creating really vibrant, great places.
A lot of questions also coming through about climate change, as if we don't have enough to manage on our plate already. Daniel and Chris are both asking about this, basically asking things like, what's planned to keep Brisbane viable if sea levels rise as predicted by the IPCC? And what do we do with heat and humidity stress given the limited walkability away from the CBD and the river? How do we adapt to that? Mark, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Challenge. I think a lot of organizations across Australia are trying to struggle with the idea of what does climate change mean and how do we better design our infrastructure to be resilient in the face of climate change. We've heard a lot, even in the last several weeks, about what a 1 in 100 year flood means, and the fact that we've had several of those in Brisbane seemingly in the last short while suggests that maybe we need to be thinking not in terms of 1 in 100 year flood, but really what are the best means to try and design resilience in whatever way that means going forward, so that our infrastructure performs well under a variety of conditions, or the conditions that we can anticipate will happen in the future, and make it as resilient as possible as we move toward that future. That's a short answer to a very complicated question, and thinking about how do we adapt our cities to better accommodate climate change.
I'm going to chip in with another short answer that's part of that solution, and that's street trees. I love street trees. I'm just going to say, they hide ugly things, they enhance beautiful things, they make it more pleasant to walk when we live in a hot climate. But there are very, very cold climates that also have great levels of active transport. So I think it is about trying to work out how we do that. So, we do great programs on street tree planting. I always encourage every community member to do more in that space. And I think we also have to remember to continually protect and think about the importance of trees across our city.
Christina, what's the role of greening and urban landscape?
I think it's about intensifying our green spaces and rethinking our water systems. So not just our river, but the huge, water catchments and waterways that we have in our cities. So, thinking about our city as a system of ridges and valleys and waterways and catchments, and they're really undervalued parts of our city. And so, is there a way to use them both as an infrastructure to provide flood resilience, as well as usable and valuable green amenity for our communities? And in that way, using that waterway to kind of really stitch together our city around these kind of green corridors and beautiful subtropical boulevards.
That's one of the fundamentals of our planning process, and certainly for our parks and resilience teams. And then we do these great programs of kids learning how to actually participate in those creeks and resilience plantings in particular as well. So I think that's really important as part of us as a community, also being in that space. It's not always about government doing this. It's about us as community members remembering to participate as well.
And just zooming out from Brisbane proper, Jean's asked a great question about what are the thoughts on the development of rural and regional and suburban areas as one of the components of better cities? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Oh, look, I've worked in regional Queensland for a lot of my career. And I don't know that we shout about the benefits of that. They're really nice places. I lived and worked for many years in Toowoomba, and it's a stunning place to live. So I think, again, we also need to be promoting the benefits of living in regional areas across our state. When I lived in Toowoomba, it was a great place to come in if you wanted to go to a concert or to the theatre, but I was 6 minutes from my office. There are times in life when that's what you want, and that's part of housing choice. And then there are times when, or there's all the way through, people want to live in Brisbane. That's part of, I think, having a sustainable approach to our region. And I think the Southeast Queensland region demonstrates that there's lots of superb lifestyle choice options.
Yeah, agree. I did a road trip around Queensland about 5 years ago, just realizing that I've never really explored my own backyard, and the cities, the communities, the people are just incredible. The landscapes are breathtaking, and it really needs to be celebrated further. And, Queensland, compared to other states, our population is so spread out across a large land area. So there really needs to be an investment in these regional areas because it does support a lot of livelihoods. And, I was talking about the Olympics bringing advancement to Southeast Queensland, but really there could be a benefit to our entire region because the athletes, they'll be arriving months ahead to kind of climatize and practice. So this is a real opportunity to strengthen and invest in our regional infrastructure and our communities as well.
Mark?
I would only add, I think one of the challenges associated with regional and more remote sections of Queensland is the level of access and infrastructure that's available there. In our own studies, we've looked at seniors and whether or not they have access, the seniors who live in regional Queensland or in remote areas of Queensland, whether they have access to healthcare, whether they have access to shopping, access to other things like that. And those are real issues. The limitations in, as simple as limitations in cell phone coverage or just being able to think about getting a taxi or a bus to travel into a hospital or a doctor's office is an important issue that I think there are opportunities there to expand the way that people do get around in those locations, what amenities they do have and the supporting infrastructure to make those regional and remote locations a lot more attractive as places to be.
We're nearly out of time, but before we go, what I really wanted to get from all three of you is if you were designing your perfect, sustainable, livable, amazing city, maybe 10, 15, 50 years in the future, what are some of the hallmarks of that place? Christina, you could start.
I think it's going to take lots of courageous conversations and bold actions. I envision in 10 years, I'll be with my 10-year-old daughter on the streets of Brisbane watching the marathon. The Brisbane will be showcased and broadcast around the world, and it will be this vibrant, green, beautiful city. The athletes will be kind of running, intertwining across the river through new connections, through large civic parks, and really just celebrate our beautiful city in terms of its kind of inclusivity, diversity, and a healthy and beautiful city.
Mark?
Great architecture.
Great architecture.
Goes without saying.
No, it doesn't. Trust me.
No.
Mark?
Yeah, I would just say it. I think, as has already been sort of suggested by Di and Christina along the way, I think there's a real element of making sure that the community develops what we want in a collective and cooperative way. I think the greater the communication that happens across people's vision for what Brisbane should be, I think is really very important. And even as an engineer, I can appreciate conversation that happens where ideas get shared and the vision for Brisbane gets shared among all of its residents. So,
even as an engineer.
even as an engineer.
Di, what does your perfect city look like?
I've got the giggles up now, Mark. Look, there's some words that Christina's used as well. For me, it's about livability. It's green, and I say that both from a sustainable perspective, but also a green buildings, green interactions, and spaces. The inclusivity and diversity, I think, is fundamental to any society. Filled with great places, which is both places and architecture. And I think there's something in there that is about citizenship. For me, there's our role as individuals as being part of those decisions, and there's also intentionality of thought. So every decision we make, everything we choose to do or not choose to do as individuals or as governments is about making intentional decisions. We have the Brisbane Sustainability Carbon Challenge where households can monitor their own carbon processes and outputs. and thinking about that and understanding what that means for us as individuals. So there's some citizenship in all of this for me, that is, how do I assist? How do I participate in this, as well as expecting somebody else to make all of this place great for me?
Well, the future looks bright with you three involved in planning it out. Thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there tonight. Thank you, Di Currie, Mark Hickman, and Christina Cho. And thank you all for coming along and listening and joining and asking your questions tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. I do hope you'll join me again next time when we're back online in June for our next Frontier Forum, which will explore some of the seismic changes happening in the world of health. I'll see you then, but for now, good night.